Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Sarah Ann Minkin, Director of Programs and Partnerships at the Foundation. Today is January 13th, 2025, and I am so grateful to be here with Ahmed Moor, one of FMEP's 2025 Palestinian Non-resident Fellows. This is our first official podcast together with you as Fellow Ahmed. Thank you for being here.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to join.
We're so excited to have you. So I want to introduce you to our audience. Our regular listeners will remember, they'll be familiar with you because we've done a few podcasts with you in the past. Here is your bio. Ahmed Moor is a Palestinian-American writer born in Gaza. He's an advisory board member of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, co-editor of the book After Zionism, published by Saqi Books, and is currently writing a book about Palestine. He also currently serves on the board of the Independence Media Foundation. Ahmed's work has been published in The Guardian, the London Review of Books, The Nation, and elsewhere. He earned a BA at the University of Pennsylvania and an MPP at Harvard University. Ahmed, can we start with you telling us a little bit more about yourself, about your background, about your family, about your studies, about what brought you to the US?
Sure, yeah. So I was born in Gaza, in Rafah, in a neighborhood called Tel Sultan. And in Palestine, like in lots of other places, the biggest determinant of whether you can actually leave and make, or I guess build a life for yourself is facility with English. And so my dad, at an early age, began to study English, attained a job as a translator initially, with a nonprofit, an American nonprofit, operating in Gaza, ANERA, American Near East Refugee Aid. And it was ANERA that allowed my family to leave Gaza. And at the time, I was about 2 years old. We went to Sudan, then back to Palestine, and then Sierra Leone and Haiti. And it wasn't until after Haiti that we got our green cards. And it was through this process that my father had commenced as a graduate student in the United States, also enabled by ANERA. Eventually, we became American citizens, so mid-90s. 95 is when I became a citizen, and it was later for my mother. And we moved to Philadelphia, which is where the Friends, the Quakers, AFSC, are headquartered. And that was kind of our American trajectory, I'd say. But it was all through initially ANERA and then AFSC.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. But
Do you still have family in Palestine?
we do. We have lots of family in Palestine. There was a process in the past where you move to the United States and you can begin to petition for other family to come over, and it continues to exist. But we applied for a green card for my uncle on my mother's side almost 18 years ago now, and he was granted an interview with the State Department. I don't recall whether it was in Jerusalem or in Cairo, right before October 2023. And of course, he never had the chance to get to that interview. So it's an extremely long and drawn out process. I do have some cousins in the US now, young women who are extremely bright, left Gaza to study, which is really the only ticket out, or used to be the only ticket out. Studied in US and UK universities, and now have jobs in the sciences. So that's another path that people have used in the past, but that's accessible to really a small number of people.
Right. Okay, thank you. So I want to ask you to tell us about your work, because you have had a non-linear path to where you are now, which I think is where you are now is that you're in a place where you're a writer, and you are crafting and sharing and shaping ideas in the public sphere. And I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about the values that you're trying to strengthen and amplify in your work. And maybe as a part of that, how do you describe the urgency of this moment that you're trying to address with your work?
Yeah. You're right that I've had a non-linear path. I mean, I started my career in financial services in New York, like many people I graduated from college with, and then just found that I continued to be drawn to the Middle East, which, like for lots of people who study the region or are exposed to the region, is this endless morass or both emotional, but and well, primarily emotional, I guess. It draws you in, and it's sticky, and it keeps you from it doesn't seem to improve. And I'm speaking generally about the Middle East, not just Palestine. And it's a source of frustration. You know, in my lifetime, um, China has moved, you know, from being a lower income country to being really a high income, very developed place. And I'm 40 years old. And yet, in 40 years, the Middle East has stagnated and continued to stagnate. So these questions, especially when you have family there, you think about it, are they continue to draw you back. It's not as though you're an immigrant. Maybe this is true for immigrants from other places, but you come to the United States and you don't forget about where you came from. And in Palestine's case, there's this overwhelming, really kind of a wound on the surface of the whole place. And so it constantly, the grievances constantly, they don't go away. They're not resolved and they don't age. There are new grievances every day. And so it draws you in and you feel stuck. And that's been the overall frame of how my career has developed. So I founded a financial services company, which was really international development work, operating in Jordan and Egypt. And I thought, you know, maybe this is an approach to trying to ameliorate some of those conditions that exist in the broader Middle East, just a small contribution. Um, and then, of course, the genocide, you know, started, and everything feels very inadequate. I think to claim that one is having an impact or shaping a conversation, you know, those are big goals, I'd say. For me, everything about speaking out about Palestine and trying to inform the conversation about Palestine, it's activism and it's about survival. Because you can sit on your hands and stew over again the endless assault, psychological assault of watching a genocide unfold in real time, or you can actually take action. And for me, that's mainly about self-preservation. I don't kid myself that, you know, we're going to change the world tomorrow. I do hope that there's some impact, but to not do this work would be unimaginable, I'd say, to not be outspoken. Um, what are the values? I mean, that the values are frankly things that I believe as an American. Like the challenge with America is that you come here as an immigrant. We were stateless. We used to sleep at airports. We had travel documents that the Israelis provided us with, and we were subhuman. And there are lots of structural critiques you can make of the system at large to say, well, that shouldn't be true for anybody, but it was true for us. And then we became American citizens, and suddenly we were human beings with rights. We mattered in ways that were really, really meaningful, that didn't exist for us as a family before we became American citizens. And so on the one hand, America's involved in all kinds of things that your listeners are aware of, you know, active support of the genocide, and then a long history of malign behavior internationally and domestically. It's far from a perfect place. But on the other hand, you suddenly become a human being. You have dignity as an American. There are values that drive the way the system can evolve. And I believe in those values. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe in freedom of association. I believe in the right of human beings to lead their lives as independently as they choose to. You know, my family's thankfully been successful in the United States. My parents went from nothing, really nothing, to being tax-paying members of society who engage with others on an equal footing. So those ideals are not meaningless, and I don't take them cynically. They're worth living by and they're worth fighting for.
And you named those as ideals, as principles and values that you hold as an American. Are, are there principles and values you would name that you hold as a Palestinian?
Yes, yeah, but they tend to be more kind of cultural. Uh, um, they tend to be more cultural values, things that relate to how you interact with your parents, and um, so those kinds of, I love Palestinian culture as a culture. Um, but I also love the cosmopolitan kind of urban life that comes from living amongst Black people and white people, people from Asia, everywhere in Asia, and that doesn't really exist in lots of places. You go to a modern European city, and the immigrant is always an immigrant, irrespective of how many generations they've been there. America is unique in that regard. Everybody can be an American, and it's about an attitude and about participation. Um, I lived in Jordan for 8 years before coming back here, 4 years ago, and that too it's a warm culture, an inviting culture, wonderful in lots of ways, but it's a native culture, and that's not really a value that I hold on to. So being Palestinian, I don't think it's a very special thing, no more than being Polish is, or being, Italian American, or whatever it is. The food is great, the people are warm. You treat elderly people with respect, those kinds of things. But there's nothing essentially about it which is more valuable than anything else. That's not how I think about it. I think the Palestinians are oppressed um, in some really profound and long-standing ways. Um, and that's the issue here.
Thank you for that. And and you're engaging in this work. You are certainly using your freedom of speech and freedom to speak out in this deeply American way. So I want to ask you to talk a little bit about what you make of this moment in time for Palestinians in Palestinian history. And I actually thank you for speaking so personally. And if I may, I want to ask you, so you were born in Rafah. Where were your parents born, and where were your grandparents born?
Yeah. So both of my parents were born in Rafah as well. My mother's family was slightly better off, and the reason is her father managed to secure. So all four of my grandparents were illiterate, which was typical of people in Palestine in the 1940s and 50s. And so, but her father managed to get a job with UNRWA distributing aid to other refugees. So my mother was born, in a cinder block home that her father had succeeded in building. So he became a refugee in 1948. My mother was born in 1956.
And he was a refugee from where?
From Barbara, which is just north of Gaza, just south of Tel Aviv. And it doesn't exist anymore. I think Ben Gurion Airport is there now, or nearby there. My father's family were from Beersheba, and their property there extended into what's now eastern southern Gaza. And so they went to the far limits of their property, they're Bedouins, and then overnight a border was erected, and they were unable to go back. And they were really impoverished as well. And my father's father died when he was young, before he was born, and so he lived in poverty for his entire childhood. and really, like lots of people in desperate situations, whether it's India or Egypt or Gaza in the 1960s and 70s, thought a lot about getting out and making it economically. And I'd say that's true for lots of people there today as well. People I've been interviewing for an essay I'm writing for The Guardian. Um, the abstraction of nationalism, it doesn't feed you, it doesn't keep your kids safe. And I'd say that's where most people are today that I've spoken with.
So that's this. I'm going to ask you to translate that piece of what you've observed and what you're naming into talking about this moment in time in history. Where are Palestinians right now in this moment in time in history?
Yeah, I think there's always, I would say, I think there's always going to be a spirit that says we need to resist, and that's there, and that's robust, and that's something that everybody imbibes at a young age as well. It's certainly something I grew up with. I'm also speaking as a father of three young children. I spoke with a mother recently who described watching her 12-day-old child die after an Israeli bombing. When my kids were 12 days old, they were wrapped in onesies and in warm places. And my wife and I doted on them and thought continuously about their well-being. And parents in Gaza today and Palestine today, they're the same. There's no difference between us and them. And so they're just thinking about their children's well-being. And so I asked this mother, is there a life for you in Gaza going forward? And she said, no. Or one of her children is a double amputee. There is no, ACA. Uh, there is no, there aren't wheelchair ramps everywhere in Gaza. Um, I'm sorry, I said ACA, I mean ADA, the American Disabilities Act. Um, and so the reality of, being attached to this place, it's real. And I've never met a Palestinian who's not deeply attached to the idea of return and of doing something to achieve liberation. Being a parent, you also understand that people want their children to survive. Um, and the Israelis have succeeded in making Gaza unlivable today. It's
Thank
not a
you.
direct answer to your question. I don't think I know enough to answer the question broadly. But I can say, again, based on these interviews I've done with deeply traumatized people, survivors of the genocide, there's no future in Gaza.
I think your answer is the answer that one hears during a genocide. And the question of survival is first and foremost and deeply personal and urgent. And thank you for that. And for the work and writing that you're doing and speaking to these people and bringing their voices.
Thanks. I mean, I'd love to share more once that's published, and I'm now actually exploring how to archive these interviews because I intend to do more of them,
Great,
and I hope I'll be able to share more about that once it's in the works.
great, fantastic. Well, on that matter, on the matter of sharing and using this platform, we're so grateful that you're taking time to be an FMEP fellow this year. And what that means is that we'll get to do programs with you. You're going to conceptualize and lead programming, which is our podcasts and maybe if there's popular demand webinars again. There was a lot of demand and attendance at webinars during COVID and then during the height of COVID, and then the world, people still have COVID, but the world seemed to go back to normal, and now nobody wants to go to webinars anymore, but everybody listens to podcasts, and we get great listeners and a great audience. And so we're going to host you this year, and you're
Awesome.
going to host conversations that you think are most urgent and necessary for our audience to hear. So I want to ask you, this is our launch podcast, so as we move into this year, what do you most want FMEP's audiences to know or to think about or to be challenged by?
Yeah, so that's a hard question to answer because so much of the conversation I want to have with different participants is related to our ongoing understanding of both the genocide and then how the genocide informs our understanding of pro-Israel work in the United States. Because I think I, like many others, view the United States as the mechanism that needs to be unlocked in order to alleviate conditions in Palestine and ultimately resolve that unbearable conflict. Um, and so I'm hoping to have conversations about the way in which the political landscape is changing in the United States. The on the ground work of recording the genocide, I feel Palestinian journalists on the ground are best equipped to do that. And so here in the United States, things are changing and they're moving fast. And I've been involved in this work for 25 years now. To say involved in 25 years, I as a student activist first, and then now, but um, things have developed very rapidly. And how does that percolate up into a political environment that enables policy changes? I don't know. But that's a question that I think is an urgent and meaningful one. I've said repeatedly, and I do believe that the urgency of the need in Palestine isn't met by the pace of change that is affected by ordinary democratic processes. So that's where you feel really disempowered and unable to impact outcomes for the children who are being exterminated in Gaza. But I want to exercise my fellows' prerogative now and transition to talking about you. Uh, you have, like an extraordinary background as well, and I'm just eager to learn. I mean, how did you get involved with this topic? Just to be clear, you've got a PhD and you've studied right-wing studies. I mean, what does that say about all this?
Thank you for asking. How I got involved in this topic, I was born into it. I'm Jewish American, born into a family that was deeply engaged in the main issues on the table for Jewish Americans in the post-war period. I'm a few years older than you are, but your description of what it means to you emotionally and in some ways sort of sociologically, psychologically, of what it means to be an immigrant and be in America and what America affords to you is very much the Jewish story that I was raised on, that my family fled to this country and became American, and we have responsibilities as Americans, responsibilities and opportunities as Americans. And so there's a lot of civic engagement, world engagement, always as a part of how I was raised. And I was also raised in a very Zionist home, and not from a place of hate, but from a place of love of our people, of Jewish people. Not from a place of like hatred of Palestinians or of Arabs, but and I was really lucky, actually, in that I had many moments in my life to unpack and unlearn that Zionist upbringing and the construction of what it means to be a Jew and be connected to the land between the river and the sea, the land of Israel, the land of Palestine, the people who live there, what it means to feel responsible and accountable to them as part of who my people are in the world. And so that I've been on this sort of life path of learning and unlearning and trying to be as responsible as I can be.
And so then thank you for that, for your honesty there. And what were the triggers, or I guess what were the points at which you took the next step in the learning or unlearning process? And I'm asking just because it's so germane to how we change the environment here.
I mean, I'm so interested in turning points for people. What are turning points? When do you see something differently than you saw it yesterday? When does something shift or lock in? And my background is as an educator. I mean, I have a PhD and I taught for years in universities, and I think that the university space or any educational space is a different space than an activist space, because people need room to try on ideas and to try out thoughts and feelings and figure out their own way within them. And they need that. We need flexibility. We need people to be able to talk to each other and to hear things that you don't hear, that there isn't necessarily room for an activist space. And to me, it's not an either or, that's really a both and. So I can just, I mean, I had many, many moments and many patient people who listened to me and gave me space. But I can say that I went to live in Israel during the Oslo period. And that was really a short window of this idea of two states for two peoples. It really legitimized a Palestinian narrative and Palestinian narratives. And I arrived with a lot of ignorance, a lot of passion and a lot of ignorance. And people spoke to me. And the idea that the right thing to do at that moment was to support two states was really, I think, fundamental for me in making it possible for me to sit down with Palestinians and listen to them. And they spoke to me and told me about their lives. And so this was when I was in college, and that was a really brief window, that moment of hope, of openness, of someone could arrive, a white Jewish American could arrive there. I spent a year at the University of Haifa, and people didn't dismiss me for my ignorant questions. They answered me and they sort of drew me in. There's a great feminist community in Haifa, and I was a part of it. And these incredible feminists, it was Jewish and Palestinian, it was Zionist and anti-Zionist, though that people weren't naming it as such at that time. Those conversations came, I think, a little bit after. But it was really through the power of feminist organizing, which is like so deeply focused on what do people need to live and to thrive, and how do you fight oppression wherever it is? Who are your allies in fighting oppression? So it was this feminist, and starting with looking at how we treat people who are so vulnerable, people on the margins, and seeing Jews and Palestinians doing it together, and then learning. And so that just set me off and down a road. And like you, I came back to the US intending to do some different work, but I was pulled back in and I couldn't resist. And so that's I think the turning point. I mean, this is a long answer to your question, but turning points are, I mean, I can name different moments sort of historically and things that happened when I realized that I recognized what was happening in the world in a way that I hadn't recognized it prior to this moment. But I can just say that having people to talk to, and someone who affirmed my own legitimacy as I was unpacking and discarding so much of what I had taken as true, made a huge difference. So
that's fascinating, because I'm struggling to understand it. So it's not a book that you read which was like really authoritative or material in that way. It was being
it's relationships.
relationships.
I can name the books that I read that changed me, for sure. But what made me open to reading those books?
Mm-hmm.
And And I can say that it's a lifelong process. I mean, there's a writer I love, actually another Jewish writer, Grace Paley, who talks about how you have to have multiple ears in order to write. You need an ear for the home and an ear for the street. You need to be able to hear how people talk. And I feel like I still navigate with multiple ears, the ear for the community that I was raised in and which I'm still deeply engaged with, and ears for other communities that I'm now deeply a part of, and completely, committed to. And so it's relationships.
Yeah. And when you found that people kind of accepted you, I think that was the word you used, or and were open to listening, I guess, to where you were coming from. Is that kind of an essential Sarah Ann speaking, or was there also an acceptance of all this political stuff that you may have carried at the time?
That's a great
I'll
question.
explain. Yeah.
No, say more.
No. I mean, I want to eager to hear your answer, and then I'll explain why I'm asking.
Oh, okay. I want to think about that. I think it's a both and, again, and it depends on which people. I found the conversations that I had when I was living in Haifa in the late 90s, people had a lot of patience, and gave me a lot of room. And there's, I think, there's a different flavor of conversations that you have in the land with and Palestinian citizens who are so used to and socialized around talking to Jews, and versus conversations that I have here. It depends on which conversation, who I'm talking to, I think, or was. I mean, I'm really focused on this time, like 25 years ago, when I really went through big transitions. There are other conversations to have about now, but I think your question is a really interesting and important question.
Well, I'm getting at it because of the campus movement. I mean, I was an activist on campus here at Penn back, in the early 2000s, and I remember these kind of fraught conversations with Zionist students, coming out of the Hillel or something. Natan Sharansky spoke once at the Hillel. That was the only time I attended, and I attended to directly confront Natan Sharansky. And then got into a heated discussion with some other students afterwards. And that's a distinct memory. And there wasn't a whole lot of give and take. And I don't feel that there's been a whole lot of give and take since in my position, which has always been kind of human rights for Palestinians. And so how do we interact with the students today? You're an educator and you were there 25 years ago. How do we interact with the Zionist students at Columbia or at Penn, or what do you say to the movement? There's a tendency to shut them out, and I'm not going to say that that's a bad idea, but it doesn't sound like that's what happened with you.
It's not what happened with me. And I feel endless gratitude to the people who had conversations with me, but I wouldn't ask them to spend their energy on me today. I love your question, and I feel like we should have a whole conversation about that with people who are on campuses now. There's a part of me that wants to say that for each and any of us, the question of how we're affirming humanity is really a central question. And so we each have to answer that for ourselves in terms of how we're relating to people from the so-called other side. That's one thing I would say. The other thing I would say is that I don't think it is correct morally, ethically, to ask people who are suffering through the catastrophe of now Palestinians to spend emotional energy on people who don't affirm the Palestinian right to life and to existence. That's different than saying, like, what I'm saying is that I wouldn't ask Palestinians to spend time educating Jews, or spend emotional energy educating or engaging with. Well, actually, you asked. I'm sorry. I'm back in my own space of saying Jews. You're saying Zionists, which is far more appropriate. and correct, because the issue here is not whether the students are Jewish or not. The issue is what their Zionism is like. So I wouldn't ask Palestinians to educate Zionists right now. I would ask Jews of all flavors to reach out to each other, because I do think that Jews have responsibilities to each other as Jews, and that we have responsibilities. I have responsibility to talk to and engage with people who are in very Zionist positions, and I do that because I'm committed also to their well-being as people and as Jews. And I also do that because I am a person who changed. I moved in my life. I had the opportunity to move from a place that was unintentional Jewish supremacy. And it really was not set out to be declared Jewish supremacy, but it was in support of a Jewish supremacist political structure. And to change from that and to move to a place where I feel every single day that I get to work for rights and liberation and freedom and dignity and security for all people in very deliberate and conscientious ways. And that the fact that I get to do that is a total privilege, and has everything to do, I think, with the fact that there were people who were willing to engage with me as I was moving on this path.
And I'm grateful for that answer. I mean, it's I think you've kind of highlighted a few really important things there. One, it is challenging and draining, and to seek to kind of reaffirm and establish the baseline treatment of every human being is equal during a genocide. It's not an academic conversation. And at the same time, you provide a path for, frankly, converting, Zionists and others who, well, really just Zionists, to something which is better, which I think is essential, right? Like, that's the only way this changes, in my view. And your response really was echoed also by Peter Beinart in a conversation we had last week. And so I wonder, yeah, I'm grateful to you for it.
That's generous of you to say. Thank you. Okay, we're going to keep talking, Ahmed. Thank you for this. Thank you for asking me. Thank you for opening this conversation to me. I didn't know going into this that this is where we were going with this conversation, and I imagine our listeners didn't either. And so thank you to all of our listeners for engaging in this conversation with us. And Ahmed, I'm so grateful to you that you're spending time with FMEP this year. I'm so excited. We're going to have a new podcast from you this week. So we're going to get to hear your voice and hopefully a lot. And I want to thank, again, all of our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Make sure to check out our website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast, for Ahmed's publications, for lots of other rich content related to Palestine and Israel. Make sure you're subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, on SoundCloud, or on Spotify, and you can watch video versions of our podcasts, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I am Sarah Ann Minkin, signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts.
Thank you, Sarah Ann.
Thank you, Ahmed.